I'll start off talking a little bit about supporting open polar and cryospheric science at NSF. And I'll say a bunch of my NSF program manager colleagues are here in the audience, but in particular, Kelly Brunt is one of our cryosphere and glaciology experts. So I'll be giving the presentation, but Kelly and others will be here for the Q&A at the end. So what is open science? Let's start there. There are lots of different definitions. And for the purposes of this talk, for this slide and some of the others, I am drawing some language from a report from a couple of years ago called Open Science by Design, Realizing a Vision for 21st Century Research. So if you're interested in it, it was published by the National Academies of Science. But first, what we're talking about is both an ethos and an ecosystem. So open science aims to ensure the free availability and usability of scholarly publications, the data that result from scholarly research, and the methodologies, including code or algorithms that were used to generate those data. So it's sharing your research and what went into your research along the way, to put it simply and perhaps overly simplistically. So why are we practicing open science or advocating and supporting open science? Increased rigor and reliability through transparency, ability to address new questions, faster and more inclusive dissemination of knowledge, broader participation in research. When we open the process, we demystify the process and allow more people to participate. We think it's an effective use of resources, right? If you put out what you've done, then other people can more effectively and more easily use it without, say, paywalls or other barriers in the way. Improved performance of research tasks, the same as kind of what I was just saying before. And again, open publication for public benefit. NSF is public money, and so it makes sense that the public should have access to your research and research products as well. So in terms of limitations, we know that there are definitely some limitations to open science, which is why we're here today talking about it. Some is costs and infrastructure, so the additional time and money that has to go into producing open science, as well as the systems and infrastructure in place to facilitate it. The structure of scholarly communications, right? Some journals have paywalls, are not open. There's not that much that we can change about that, at least in the short term, if you want to publish in particular journals. That, of course, is changing, and there are many options for your publications, not what we're going to focus on today. The lack of supportive culture, incentives, and training. Right? If you are working with either partners or advisors, collaborators that are very, I'd say, closed, that can be hard to break out of, right? And so we want to support changing that structure, and creating that more supportive culture, creating incentives and providing training. Privacy, security, and proprietary barriers to sharing. There are, to be fair, some valid reasons why not everything is open all the time, but sometimes there are barriers that are in the way that are there, whether for legalistic reasons or unintended reasons that might get in the way. And finally, disciplinary differences. Some disciplines are at different stages in their open science journeys, and some are more open than others. So things that NSF, or at least our part of NSF, is hoping to address, and we'll talk about a little bit. These limitations that we're hoping to address would be costs and infrastructure, so providing support and funding to help make your science more open, providing infrastructure to help make that happen, providing incentives, supporting training, trying to reduce barriers to sharing, and our polar science, at least cryosphere, yep, there's different disciplines both within cryosphere, and cryospheric science itself obviously is a discipline, but in polar science, we work in a regional sense and not in a disciplinary sense. And so we hope to build more norms across all of polar science so we can smooth out some of those disciplinary differences. So where are we coming at from a policy point of view? You might be familiar with the Office of Polar Programs' current data policy that currently is in a Dear Colleague letter, catchily termed NSF 16-055. it's easy to Google if you put that in. The link is there, and it has requirements for data management plans, repositories, timelines, and things like that. One thing I want to emphasize, though, is that this is not the first data policy OPP has had. It's not the last. And we seem to be kind of leapfrogging with the polar research community here, where NSF puts out a policy, the research community meets it and continues to push it forward, continues to be even more open and sharing even more than previously predicted. And so then the next policy can move forward from there to meet the community and perhaps push it a little bit forward as well. And so there's that, I'd say, give and take between NSF and the research community, which is really great. Because ultimately, right, when a data management plan comes in, it gets reviewed by the research community, by the reviewers. And so the reviewers are really powerful in providing suggestions for more open science, other repositories, better ways to share, things like that, that we at NSF can help enforce. And more or less, we try and default towards open and align with a statement as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So you might have seen that statement in a lot of different, whether it's data policies or data statements, approaches. The idea is we want open science unless you have a really, really, really good reason not to. And there are some good reasons not to, and we can get into those. Sometimes there might be traditional or indigenous knowledge, concerns at hand. There might not be the appropriate informed consent. You might need to make sure that data is anonymized. You might have to get community approval. There might be intellectual property concerns. But again, the default is open and you have to convince us otherwise, is the general approach. Thanks for putting the link in the chat, Liz. So what principles are we working off of to support our open science? And I would say our ethically open science. We have our FAIR principles for data management. So that's findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And then we have the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. That's for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And we could have whole talks on FAIR and CARE, and that's not the purpose of this talk. You can read some more about them there. And I would also say to keep an eye out that this balancing of FAIR and CARE is one of the key, I'd say, focuses of the data management collaboration team over the next couple of years of the Arctic Research Plan. And so if you're interested in FAIR and CARE, implementing them and balancing them and I guess mutually reinforcing them in the Arctic space, pay attention to those other IARPC activities as well. Come on, there we go. So I want to touch on the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program itself, which is probably the right home within NSF for supporting open polar and cryospheric research. So the Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program, or Polar CI, Polar Cyber, different people abbreviate it different ways, all means the same thing. We consider proposals that promote effective collaboration between polar and CI researchers. It's both in the Arctic and Antarctic solicitations. They both come to me. So if you're working on a polar project that has both Arctic and Antarctic, it's okay, we can make that work. And we also support proposals that provide significant benefit to the polar research community. Again, the emphasis is on benefit to the community, including things like cost-effective data transfer, long-term curation, standardization, management, and discovery of data and metadata. So that's really relevant for what we're talking about today. Visualization, manipulation, and analysis, particularly for understanding complexity, including polar and cryospheric applications for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Access and interoperability across scientific disciplines. You might recognize some of the FAIR acronym being mirrored here. Promoting effective use of high performance computing, also high throughput computing for direct and sustainable advances in current Arctic and Antarctic research. Sorry, I copied it from the Arctic and forgot to add Antarctic there, which is say polar. And then e-learning and educational tools based on cyber infrastructure components as well. We work across NSF really broadly, right? So we have our Polar Cyber Infrastructure Program, but we work all the way across the Geoscience Directorate that the Office of Polar Programs sits within. And we also work with the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. And so we have opportunities like EarthCube, Cyber Infrastructure for Sustained Scientific Innovation, the FAIR and Open Science Research Coordination Network solicitation. CloudBank and PATH are both ways to get access to different types of cloud and high throughput computing resources, and many others. And so all of this includes support for open, flexible, scalable, and interoperable CI that hopefully will enable broad and diverse community of geosciences to integrate all of that open data, those models, software, and ultimately knowledge. So GEO is kind of OPP's parent, is looking to build on existing efforts by promoting an ecosystem for open geoscience, and you can read their Polar research that links data and models, crosses big data and small data, and networks knowledge from diverse perspectives, that builds on EarthCube, which is this previous program, builds on that EarthCube experience and investments to move forwards towards flexible, scalable workflows and tools, and provides exemplars for advancing NSF priority areas for open inclusive science, fair data, reproducibility and replicability, care and trust principles. The trust principles are really more applicable for repository level rather than researcher level, and be a Jedi, so belonging, accessibility, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I've talked a lot. I want to make sure that we get to the so where's the money coming from and how do I get it side of things. So existing and upcoming solicitations, all of this open science stuff that I've been talking about, the Polar Cyber Program where your proposals might live, we support a full range of different types of proposals that could come into NSF, whether that's the standard or collaborative award that you're used to, supplements, there should be a comma there, planning proposals, research coordination networks, workshops, career awards for early new faculty, mid-career advancement awards for people who are at recently tenured stage that want to gain new skills by working with new partners, career life balance awards, REUs, so research experience for undergraduates, rapids, so quick turnaround for late breaking events, that type of thing, eager awards, that's high risk, high reward type funding, teacups, that's the tribal colleges and universities program, RUI, ROA, so that's research at undergraduate institutions or research opportunity awards, phased, so that's for facilitating scientists and engineers with disabilities, HBCU, EIR, that's historically Black colleges and universities, excellence in research. I think that's most of them. I might have forgotten any, but the point is we have lots of different ways to support your science and they can all come into Polar Cyber one way or another. And some that I want to emphasize in particular, one, there's still time in this fiscal year for supplements. So say you're like, hey, you know what? It's taken me more effort to open my code up or to share my code than I thought it would, and you have a currently active award. We could discuss possibly applying for a supplement to provide support to do that. Again, with a supplement, the regular caveats apply, so it has to be within the original scope of the award. There's still, I think, until the end of this summer, NSF has a special policy that provides supplements that are in response to COVID impacts or changes to the award. So yeah, maybe you're sharing your data or code might end up needing more resources. Think about open code or open data supplements. And I'll also mention that things like planning proposals are new in the last version of the NSF PAPPG. So it's the proposal guide and guidance and guidelines. I always forget what the actual acronym means, but you can check those out. There's ways that you can work on developing a proposal together. And I'll also emphasize that we have this Dear Colleague letter on supporting data and sample reuse in polar research. And so that includes all sorts of things so you can mention that and use it to kind of strengthen a potential proposal. Includes things like data and sample rescue, making data and samples available, reusing data and samples, and facilitating reuse. So all of that, again, feeds into open science. So our takeaways are: do your homework and come up with a plan, put together a paragraph or a one-pager to your program officers, and don't be afraid to ask if support or what the right fit with a program might be. And we support all sorts of well-reviewed, great ideas. So looking forward to chatting more about that. But again, hand it over to Kaitlin Harbeck, my colleague at NASA, to give her presentation before we move on to the Q&A section.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alan. And thanks, Alan, for giving a great overview of kind of a high level of what open science means. Generally speaking, open science definitions at NASA and NSF are the same, so I won't walk through all of those again. But first, I'll just introduce myself to everyone who doesn't know me. My name is Kaitlin Harbeck, and I am the Deputy Program Manager for NASA's Cryospheric Sciences program at NASA headquarters, alongside Torsten Marcus. So Liz, thanks for having me today. Go to the next slide. All right, and I also want to thank Kevin Murphy, who's NASA, the Earth Science Division's Chief Earth Science Data Officer, for putting together most of this material. So thanks to him for compiling a lot of this info for you all. So over the course of the last couple of years, NASA's Science Mission Directorate has started to put a real emphasis on how to best dive into this landscape of changing science for the better, as Alan mentioned in the definitions of open science. So there are three primary goals that NASA is going to try and tackle over the next decade at least, but really started back in 2019. And those three top level goals were to develop and implement capabilities to enable open science. So that's the bedrock and the foundation of NASA's open science activities. Continuous evolution of data and computing systems. We're sort of in the middle of that right now, and we're relying on PIs to tell us what they need in order to make their open science goals possible. And then finally, harnessing the community and strategic partnerships for innovation outside of existing NASA partnerships. So I know there's a lot of text here, but the three big ideas I think are the 1.1, 2.1, and 3.1 goals. NASA really needs to develop across SMD, and especially within Earth Sciences, as far as I'm concerned, developing and implementing a consistent open data and software policy that is tailored for SMD. And in my opinion, I really think that we need a better tailored policy for the Earth Sciences division as well. Right now, it's sort of up to individual program managers to decide how they want to approach open science requirements amongst their PIs. And it makes things a little bit difficult for folks who are applying for money from different programs to meet the certain requirements and goals of those program managers. So a standardized approach is definitely necessary. Something that came out of the 2017 decadal survey was the development of the Earth System Observatory missions. That's these 5 missions that are just starting to be developed within SMD or within NASA Earth Sciences right now. So NASA is taking this opportunity of these new 5 Earth Science missions to develop standardized approaches for all new missions moving forward, and for the sponsored research that comes out of that to encourage the adoption of advanced techniques for sharing data and for sharing results. And then finally, developing a community of practice and standards group where we can kind of work on changing the culture of sharing results and sharing data across SMD and across Earth Sciences. Next slide, please. So in case you're not familiar, these are the 5 sort of decadal survey missions that are in the process of being developed right now within Earth Sciences. So we have the 5 missions that are being developed: surface biology and geology, surface deformation and change, clouds, convection and precipitation, aerosols. Actually, those 2 items have been kind of combined into one mission. Now it's called atmospheric observations and precipitation, I believe. And then mass change. And you might notice that there's no obvious cryosphere connection in most of these, but don't worry, there's going to be a cryo connection probably in all of these missions. So there'll be definitely opportunities for folks to get involved at the ground level for developing these missions. Next slide, please. So in addition to those 5 designated observables that we're calling the Earth System Observatory, there's also the Earth System Explorer missions, which are going to be developed a little bit further out into the future. You'll notice that ice elevation and snow depth and snow water equivalent are 2 of those. And then thinking even further out into the future, we have the decadal survey incubation teams that have just been selected for thinking about what sort of measurement strategies are going to be required over the course of the next decade and beyond. So planetary boundary layer and surface topography and vegetation were those two incubation level projects that are just now getting started. Next slide, please. So SMD and Earth Sciences divisions are taking advantage of this Earth System Observatory approach for developing a whole new framework for how to approach data management and results management coming out of NASA missions. So starting with these missions as well as NISAR, it's going to be standard practice that all mission data, metadata, software, databases, publications, and documentation are going to be available on a full, free, open, and unrestricted basis, starting with the Phase B development timeline of those missions. There won't be any period of exclusive access to any of these materials for these missions being developed. Also, science workshops and meetings are going to be open to broad participation and documented in public repositories. So no more closed science meetings for each of these missions as they become developed. You may notice that these continue to be sort of high-level requirements and tasks that NASA is working on, but as we move forward into this transition to open science, each of these definitions are going to get a little bit more clear and a little bit more defined with actual goals in mind, and not just sort of these high-level definitions. Next slide, please. So how is the Science Mission Directorate doing this? So right now we're in this 5-year effort called Transform to Open Science, or TOPS, that it's focused on capacity building, engaging with partners that are both within and outside of NASA, and incentives for PIs and research groups, universities, industry to help accelerate science discovery through open science. So SMD has identified next year as the Year of Open Science, and is doing so by partnering with professional organizations such as the OpenScapes Champions Program, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, publishing transformative open science articles in different high-impact journals, engaging with historically excluded communities. I know that Allen mentioned they're doing the same thing at NSF, and establishing a TOPS GitHub repository for folks to start to work on sharing and bettering, improving how they're sharing their code. Different capacity building, and then also developing a better way to incentivize the sharing of data and the sharing of code, and this development of best practices as we move forward into this 5-year transformation to open science initiative. Next slide. So engaging the community in this transformation process is, I think, the most important thing. We need to hear from you, our PI community, our end user community, as to how to prioritize the needs of our users. So that's what this TOPS initiative is aiming to do. The OpenScapes program, I think, is a pretty interesting one. So it's an approach for doing better science in less time. So OpenScapes was developed by a private company who received a NASA grant to offer mentorship, teaching, coaching, and community organizing for PIs, for science teams, and for research groups who want to better their open science practices. So it's a multi-month long program to help mentor teams into becoming better open science participants. Also, something that NASA is exploring is utilizing DOIs to help enhance citability of data products as well as research publications, and to help track open science contributions. So your work in sharing your code and your data products won't go unnoticed or uncited in the future, in terms of providing these things at NASA DACs. Next slide. All right, so I know I've gone through this a little bit fast, but I want to have time for some questions. So most of the material I presented here is about what NASA is planning to do at a high level over the course of the next 3 to 5 years as those Earth System Observatory missions start to be developed and to come online. So what I would encourage everyone here to do, if you're interested, is to join NASA's open source science initiative email list, and I'm happy to drop the link for that in the chat. They've been holding open science listening sessions throughout 2022, and they're planning on continuing doing that throughout the rest of the year, and especially that'll heat up more as we move into that Year of Open Science in 2023. Right now, there aren't a huge amount of funding opportunities for folks who are looking to improve their software, to release it, to make it more open source and to make it a little bit more accessible. But there is this one opportunity. It's the Supplemental Open Source Software Awards. It was released at the beginning of ROSES 2022, so in mid-February, and it's the F8 solicitation if you're interested in reading a little bit more about it in NSPIRES. So these are supplemental awards to existing NASA awards that are used to encourage converting legacy software into more modern code that can be released and better understood and have a kind of generally accepted open source license. So yeah, like I said, this would add a software component to an existing parent research and analysis award. So if you have an existing NASA award, this could be something that you could consider. However, they are incredibly competitive. There's only a very, very small amount of money outside in NASA's open science budget for all of SMD for FY 2023. They plan to select probably no more than 10 of these awards this year. And it's a rolling proposal process. So if you're interested in applying for this sort of funding, you can apply anytime between now and the middle of March next year. Something else that I think is really interesting, and I've been mentioning this with our science teams and our PIs, is this OpenScapes Champion program. So it's a multi-month program that's led remotely and designed to help foster incremental and sustainable change amongst our science teams, and then giving them the tools to extend those opportunities out into their communities and into their universities. We in the Earth Sciences Division have already held 2 Earth System Observatory mission data processing study workshops. There was one held last October and one held in March of this year. And these workshops are being used as a tool to identify architectures that can help meet those larger, broad ESO mission open science goals, enable data system efficiencies, promoting open science principles, and seeking opportunities that support Earth system science and that will best serve the community. So the next workshop will be at some point in August. I'm not quite sure on the dates yet or what the main topics of that workshop will be, but if you join that Open Source Science Initiative email list, I'm sure that there'll be information coming out about that in the near future. I think that was all I had, Liz. So if you wanted to open it up for questions, I think now would be the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alan and Kaitlin, for great presentations. So folks, feel free to either use the raise hand function that's on your Zoom toolbar under reactions if you want to ask a question out loud, or you can put it in the chat. And if you'd rather ask something anonymously, you can chat me directly and I will read it without your name.
And while people are coming up with their questions, I didn't mention a lot of the, I structured a lot of my presentation around how we could support additional open science activities. And so I didn't focus so much on the areas that are already working and doing great work. So for example, the Arctic Data Center and the Polar Geospatial Center, Navigating the New Arctic Community Office has provided some great training as well, and I know that those are going into the future. And so if you're interested in looking into existing training opportunities and things like that, they are out there and being NSF supported right now too.
Yeah, Twilight, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that information. I was wondering if each of you could chat about too, if there are, I mean, you sort of hit on it, Kaitlin, I think with some of the OpenScapes a bit, or maybe some more, actually some more of the kind of like cloud computing and other availability. But anyhow, I'm interested if each of you could talk about kind of thinking about NASA DAX or thinking about the Arctic Data Center, if there are things that are underway or coming up too that might be happening at that data archive space to help to ensure that data coming in for archive is, you know, more accessible, reusable, these sorts of elements. If there's efforts in that kind of step of the process. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I'll start talking about the Arctic data center that NSF supports. I don't know, I was only thinking of Arctic before. We've got our USAP data center and our Antarctic Meteorological Research and Data Center as well. But so for example, at the Arctic data center, they run, when you work with them to put in your data, right, they will run automated checks on the data that you submit to flag things like, hey, there's not enough metadata description here. Hey, you're using proprietary formats. Hey, you're structured this in this weird way. Have you thought about doing it this way so that it's self-described? You know, those sorts of basic fundamental things, working with PIs to help them create more reusable data sets. One of the things that they would also really like me to talk about, you might have seen the Arctic Data Center portals feature, where different either research groups or disciplinary groups or things like that can create portals to better access and visualize certain data sets. So like the Arctic Report Card has done some, the Permafrost Data Gateway has done some, there's a social science portal, there's lots of them there. And in the future, what that hopefully is going to look like is that individual research groups can create shared workspaces. So you can start putting your data into the Arctic Data Center and not have it publicly shared yet, so that you can share it within a research collaboration. And then eventually say like, okay, now we're ready to open it up for everybody to use. And the idea there is not to create closed spaces for people, but more getting people to talk with their data center sooner, getting them to have that ongoing relationship with the data center. And once it gets the data in, then it's easier to click that, okay, share and go button, so that we don't have people who are like, oh my gosh, my paper is about to be accepted and the data needs to be open. Oh, can you please help me share this tomorrow? Or my project report is due in 3 days ago. Can I get this DOI so I can submit my project report? And trying to get away from that sort of model. So yeah, those are examples from the Arctic Data Center. And I'd say similar efforts are underway at the Antarctic counterpart. And in addition to all of that, things like regular trainings and webinars as well.
Thanks, Alan. And actually, thanks, Twyla, for asking that question. So something that NASA is starting to think about doing is transitioning away from DACs into these new facilities called Science Enabling Centers. And the idea is kind of over the next 3 years, kind of threefold. They want, or NASA as this wants the DACs to shift from being generally responsible for all access to science data systems to being specialized in improving usability of data and software for each of their user communities, with an emphasis on supporting open source science. Let's see what else. They want these science enabling centers to be more usable for better user engagement, whether it's a web interface or an API to better improve user experience. I know that it's still very early on in the process. One of the things that have come out of this, the ESO, the Earth System Observatory data processing studies, sort of thinking about how best to handle this transition to science enabling centers, namely because the existing policies around cybersecurity, ITAR, other web limitations really have limited NASA's ability to enable and serve open science, and that policy should be evolving and should evolve. So that's something that'll come out of the transformation to open science process as we move over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. So DACs will change into those science enabling centers.
Thanks so much.
And yeah, thank you for that question, Twyla. And one thing I also wanted to add on top of that is I was talking a lot about our digital resources, but we also have different physical repositories that NSF supports, so that the samples that you collect can also be reused, whether it's for further research or whether for education and outreach. And so things like the Polar Rock Repository, the Ice Core Facility, things like that, Marine Core Repository. When we think about open science, we often immediately think about digital data code, but it's not limited to that. And so we want when we talk about data, we should take a really broad, inclusive definition of our data. And I also should have mentioned, in addition to the data repositories, more on the research activities level, things like wait, what science is happening now, so that, you know, it's not just, oh, 2 years after the fact, open science. Things like the Arctic research mapping application can help visualize what projects are doing what science in a given year. You can see where cruise tracks are going, where there are long-term sites, things like that. And I know that outside of the NSF scope, right, there's other great resources that do similar things in places like Greenland as well.
I'll also add real quick that IARPC just launched our vessel matrix for the year, the list of all of the research cruises coming up. So some information about all of the expeditions happening. So I'll drop that link in the chat once I'm not talking at the same time. Ken, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Ken, sorry to interrupt you, but yeah. We can't hear you. Yeah.
James, you can hear me now?
Yes, it's a little quiet, but we can hear you.
Okay, let me try to boost that up.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
sounds good now.
Perfect.
Okay. So two comments or one sort of a question. Hearing the NSF and NASA goals for open science, I feel like there's quite a big difference between the two. NASA seems a little bit more ahead or aggressive. That's a good thing. And in their requirements, that's my read on it. And so I just wanted to encourage Allen and NSF to put out those requirements. The community follows you. You have always the clause of justify it if you can't do it right now. If you don't have the expense, if you don't have the time, if you don't have the ability, explain it, maybe not the ability. And it's not, it's not a hard requirement, but why can't NSF also just say all code must be open, everything open? I saw your limitations. I agree with them. But NASA has those same limitations and somehow is, I feel like, pushing the community a little harder. So you don't have to answer that right now, but I just wanted to encourage you to both ask why you're not in the same place and encourage you to go there. I'll jump to my second.
Just to respond really quickly, we're working on it. Thank you for the encouragement, and we're working on it. It's great to hear.
Okay.
Hey, can I add a little bit more, Ken? As someone who, I have a foot in both houses right now. I'm 80% NSF and 20% NASA. And I'd say, I think at face value, it looks like NASA's way ahead. Keep in mind, they've been dealing with big data sets, for as far as in-house for a lot longer. So they have their hands on that. They have a good understanding of that. I think what you're touching on is some of the language in the solicitations, and it'll become more uniform. But I think they're roughly at the same state, believe it or not. I really think that both sides are pushing this just a little differently from their strengths and their backgrounds. So it's all there. I think what's great to see here, I think, is to have everybody in the same room having the same conversations and sharing ideas across the agencies. So I hear you. I just think that some of it's a little bit visual more than actual behind the scenes nuts and bolts.
Okay.
Yeah, Kelly, I totally agree with that. NASA, you're right, Ken, does have a lot of policy and statements saying that proposals or projects must use these open science principles, but right now there really isn't any mechanism in place to ensure that PIs are actually doing these things, to provide more financial support outside of what SMD is able to provide for improving legacy code. So yeah, most of our things are still very, very top level, and working on making them a little bit more structured and concrete as we move into this new framework.
Okay. My second comment, and I just thought of this while hearing Twyla, these presentations, and then Twyla asking about working more with the data repositories early on. But I believe there's a journal of methods that has an agreement where if you submit the proposed method sort of in the proposal preparation phase, they will guarantee publication regardless of what happens with the outcome or the results of that method. And I have recently become the chief editor of Earth System Science Data, ESSD journal. And so I was actually thinking, could there be a collaboration either between that journal and NSF NASA or the data centers where people could submit the data collection plan? And we are then somehow I'm not going to promise publication if you go and you don't actually collect the data or something, but we could encourage others. And I think it's a pretty good journal. It's a higher impact factor than Nature data. It might get people thinking earlier on about how to collect the data, how to store it, how to publish it. And then the repositories are also saying, you get more from putting your data here, not just all the benefits you're selling or pushing and that we all agree on, but a citable, journal paper also comes along with it if you publish here. So I'd be happy to discuss that more. I'm not sure who the right people to discuss that with, but it's just an idea I thought of. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting and exciting. And the other thing that I would also mention is, I think increasingly we're seeing data sets come in on biosketches as research products, right? Where people, traditionally it's just papers, and data papers are great to fully explain a data set. I do want to, not trying to say just a DOI for a data set is, it is a different thing than a data paper, but I've been seeing more of both of those sorts of things on biosketches as significant outcomes of previous work. And that's exciting to see, right? They're research products in their own right, code as well. And it's not just, it doesn't have to be just the fully fledged research paper to be noticed and be valuable, which is great to see. And I'm not sure exactly the right place either, but I also immediately think of places like, if you're interested in working with repositories, there's this Council of Data Facilities that EarthCube has supported. And I feel like I've seen similar sorts, not the same sorts of efforts, but kind of similar sorts of efforts in the Earth Science Information Partners, different action groups there, ESIP Federation, where they've been thinking about different ways to think about publication of research products. So that might be one place to look as well for potential partners, I mean.
Folks have other questions? Again, you can use the raise hand function or chat anonymously to me if you prefer. Yes, Andy, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Kaitlin. Thanks, Alan, for the overviews. I'm wondering what, if any, plans are in place for both NASA and NSF to kind of work together in order to kind of come up with a coherent kind of landscape or kind of set of policies that scientists can follow to avoid the risk of there being the NSF way of open science and the NASA way of open science. So it'd be great to hear some more about that. Thanks.
So thanks, Andy. That's a great question. I think this meeting is, at least from a polar sciences perspective, is sort of the start of that conversation. We're both agencies and both kind of program offices are just at the start of this open science journey. So this is the start of making sure that we're asking the same of our research communities when it comes to open science.
Yeah, I'll second that, and also kind of reiterate what I was saying before, that we're kind of playing, like I say, leapfrog a little bit with our research community as well. And so if the research community is holding us accountable and more importantly, holding each other accountable to standards within the research community, there is going to be some level of both bottom up and the top down in terms of what that means for open polar science. Or at least that's what I'm hoping.
Thanks.
I'll just toss in 2 cents here. I think it's going to be hard too. Both agencies have sort of a different mode. Not only does NASA collect it, but it also provides a lot of the data. So you get this like level 0, level 1, then level 3, all the way out to where the science community can use it. NSF isn't in that mode. But, you know, we're basically requesting people to make the data available, but it's not a level 0, level 1, level 3 type data product that's getting out there. So there will always be fundamental differences. But I think, you know, you and some of Kent's points are spot on. I think if these two agencies come up with a sort of concerted type of language, it's going to help the community downstream. And hopefully what we end up with is language that doesn't create gaps or make it difficult for folks. Hopefully it's just super inclusive to, you know, for everybody that's struggling with these concepts. We're not trying to make it hard on anybody. We're trying to make it easy for everybody. That makes sense.
Yeah, just to respond, I think the thing that's driving my question is that there's, I think, you know, the communities within NASA and NSF, there's definitely kind of overlap between the research communities, but I also think there is kind of maybe kind of a expertise in different areas, and I'm thinking in particular with perhaps NSF having more people who are familiar with working with indigenous and community-based knowledge versus those people in NASA, and so there is definitely overlap, and those two kind of sides of open science can leverage each other's expertise and build better policies, and also help researchers understand how to navigate that balance. That I forget whether it was Kaitlin or Allen. I think it was Allen who spoke about that balance. But I think it's really important that we kind of leverage expertise in order to understand that, because we can sometimes go in, you know, from a physical science aspect, you may just think, oh, all data should be open, all data should be shared, and not cognizant of the care principles. And so both education and also developing policies using expertise in those domains would be really good.
That's great feedback.
We have time for one more question if anyone has a final burning question. And if not, I'll ask Kaitlin, Kelly, and Allen if you have any final thoughts you'd like to close out with.
Nope, just the same thing we always say. Contact your program officer. We love to hear from you and talk about your ideas.
Yep, ditto.
Great. Well, on that note, I will say thank you very much to Allen, Kelly, and Kaitlin for the presentation, and to all of you for coming. I put this in the chat as well, but the recording of this event will be available both on our YouTube channel and on the event page within a few days, probably by tomorrow. So if you know someone who missed it, or if you came late, you can check that out there. I will also collect all of the links that were shared in the chat and make sure that they are on the event page as well, so that if you missed one, you can catch it. And again, thank you, and hope to see you at a future IARPC event. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.